were they when your school organised school buses to pass through Peckham on Route 63, making sure the girls made it there and back without being beaten senseless for no reason, or cut for cutting their eyes a little, or happy slapped for laughs on YouTube? Where were you when Surrey Quays was full of abject poverty, young working class single mothers in pink tracksuits called chavs, by the very people who now want their flats? And where were you when we took our children to daycare, barely children ourselves, winging it and making a mess, teaching them their ABCs over baked beans and chips, or jollof rice, saltfish and plantain? And where were you when I was too embarrassed to say that I was raised on these estates, ashamed to bring my friends from Cambridge back to mine, living two separate lives in two separate worlds, surviving one day at a time? And where were you when we were four to a bed, subletting friends of our immigrant parents so they'd avoid the last humiliation of sleeping on the streets? And where were you when council workmen called us trouble for reporting things, green liquid oozing from the sockets of our hallways, noisy neighbours, swear words offending the ears of children, big men and big women before we were even done being children? And where were you when we had to grow up quickly? Blood and drugs lined the corridors in my part of Rotherhithe. Racists on my landing calling us you people, fearing for my life every time I passed Trisha's door in case her dog would devour my caramel body. And where were you when youngers and elders smoked and passed the time, crowning themselves kings of concrete jungles and dukes of all mankind? Where were you when I sang books from boxes, retreated to my room to dream of Maximo Park and metal, trying desperately to forget the men who threw money at me, the ones who harassed me and lusted after my 15-year-old body? And where were you when we raised our families, put food on tables against immeasurable odds, buried friends and the friends of our friends, and watched through tears as our fathers left? And where were you when we swam through oceans of blood, butterflied through webs of lies and alcohol, smoked cigarette butts from the floor, having underage sex, doing anything and everything to forget? And where were you when aunties told us off, trying to keep us on the straight and narrow, looking out for us and our mothers? They worked hard to keep us alive. And where were you when we built this city, built these communities, made our bread, imperfect but a blessing nonetheless? That's right. Here we go again. You were somewhere dreaming. You were somewhere comfortable, on the other side of the River Thames, internet shopping, wearing denim, planning vacations in the sun and trips to Sudan and Uganda to build schools and hospitals. You were drinking macchiatos and lattes in Italian coffee shops, passing the time away. You were somewhere dreaming. You were somewhere comfortable. You were somewhere safe, wearing denim on the other side of the River Thames, telling yourself that all men were born equal. So I'm originally from London, and I moved to Coventry kind of back and forth since about 2012 when my family moved there. And it's interesting actually trying to absorb myself in the Midlands poetry scene. At first it was really different, and I did find it quite challenging. I think, you know, the whole idea of everybody kind of knowing each other, there being some cliques and kind of people already knowing the scene really well, I think that was a little bit daunting for me. And also, I suppose, being someone who was quite active in the London scene, trying to kind of replicate that in the Midlands was hard. But over the last 2 years, I think that I found my grounding and I've connected with some really great people. And I'm actually really doing a lot on the more kind of production side now as well, which I think has really helped to just absorb me in a wider kind of creative community in Birmingham. But I think what is really exciting about the Midlands, the West Midlands in particular, is the fact that there is this hunger to really get out there, and there's this excitement, I suppose, to replicate some of the things going on in London, but with, of course, a Midlands spin. And where I live in Coventry, we've just one city of culture, so I imagine that being really important to the community, to the scene. There's going to be an injection of money, so I guess I'm looking out for what comes of that. So Alice Walker, the great Alice Walker, I'm summarising it, I think paraphrasing it, but she basically said that poetry is the language of rebellion, and that's the heart of it all, really. And Nina Simone, the great Nina, also said the role of an artist is to document the times. And so those two things are really key to my practice and what I live by as a creative and as a person, particularly a person in a body that is often politicised, being a black woman with a migrant history. And so writing through poetry as a protest to the status quo is really important to me. All of my work, be it community organising, producing, poetry, anything that I do really involves bringing marginalised voices from the margins to the centre. That is what binds it all together. So my priorities are always the people of colour, the black people, the women, the disabled, the LGBTQ, the young, the old, whoever is marginalised particularly at that moment. And so for me, I think poetry is often the best way to get that out there. It's also, because it's such closely linked to music as well, music is something that is really a universal language, and I think it's really important that to note that in the traditions of the global south, music and poetry are everyday and inherent and often used as ways to rebel, and very accessible to the common public, to everybody basically. So I just think for me it's a kind of equalising force, poetry, in many ways, and you know, if you use it well and use it properly and you use your art as a way as a vehicle to talk about what you really want to say, maybe it's often an easier way to kind of get people to listen, because sometimes just banging on can be a way that people just shut off, and we never want people to shut off from injustice, right? So you always have to think of ways to bring it to them, maybe through entertainment and things like poetry. My poem Denim is a poetic short film, as well as obviously being a page piece, and it explores gentrification in South East London and looking at it through the lens of someone from South London who has now moved to the Midlands because of social cleansing, where I am from. And I take a trip down memory lane. I think about my growing up and the things that I've seen and put it into the context of a wider social commentary. And I suppose people always ask me, why is it called denim, which is quite funny. The idea of denim, it's a commons man, working man's kind of jean clothing that has been something that all people use. So it's just an interesting idea of how, I suppose, the common can become the everyday, and how at first you really notice these things and the changes, and you actually then, it becomes commonplace and you become almost numb to it. It's just the everyday. And I suppose part of why I wrote it is because I was taking a trip down to, well, the same route that I used to take going to school once, and I just realised everything was different, and it really struck me and it saddened me as well. And I have these conversations a lot with people, and they ask me, what is wrong with change? There's absolutely nothing wrong with change, and actually change is good, but the problem is when you leave those who built a city behind and gave it its culture and its vibrancy. That is the problem. When you create businesses and don't hire the locals, or you move into an area and expect that the locals should almost bow to you and they should no longer kind of operate how they operate. You hear these stories about, you know, people kind of moving in and calling the police because there's a party and all of that, just not understanding where you're coming. And I've seen that too as someone who lived in Peckham for a bit as well, and I frequent Notting Hill and places like that a lot, and of course East London. And East London being a really key example of the effects of gentrification, closely followed by Brixton, and Peckham is now on the tail too. So I come from it from a lens of someone in London observing it, but I also hear that, and I can see there's a lot of that kind of going on in Birmingham in particular at the moment. And gentrification is a global phenomenon actually. So I spoke to a lot of friends in different parts of the world, like Johannesburg and New York and Lisbon and Berlin, and they all said this is something that is happening. And the common factor is it's working class people of all races, it's people of colour of all social standing that are being moved, and communities are being broken apart, and that's the big problem that I have with gentrification. And so I wanted to talk about it in my poem because why not?